So what is monetarism? The easy way to summarize it is this famous dictum of Milton Friedman's. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And it's fascinating that he becomes an expert in inflation because the first research and the first major research product of monetarism is that theory of the Great Depression in a monetary history of the United States. And that is a theory of a deflation, all prices going down. And he will go back to an idea that Irving Fisher had popularized, but a very old idea, almost a truism, the quantity theory of money, which says the level of the price level is related to the amount of money circulating in an economy. So if you have more money, prices go up. If you have less money, prices go down. Now, this seems like very basic and almost too basic to bear repeating, but Friedman is saying this very basic relationship holds true even in an advanced industrial economy. And that is what people have started to doubt. And if you think about money, you think about banks, you don't think necessarily about the federal budget, spending, and taxation. And what you see happens in American economics, the textbooks previous to the Keynesian revolution, they spent a lot of time on money. They spent a lot of time on interest rates. You can do word counts, and other scholars have done the word counts. And then word count for money after World War II just plummets. And you start seeing things like taxation, budget, those things go up. So that what happens is the economics profession shifts its attention. It just looks away from money to other things. And Friedman is one of the few who's saying, no, money still matters. Money still counts. And it's a very counterintuitive argument to make. It's a very historical argument to make. And this is absolutely fascinating to me. With Anna Schwartz, he develops this 150-year time frame. He also has students working on episodes of hyperinflation in different periods of time. He's also looking back to like ancient history, inflationary episodes there. And he's saying this is a law of economics. This is something that recurs throughout time. It's not historical, right? It's not contingent. It's a law of economics. And, his Keynesian counterpoints are saying, no, that's not relevant any longer. Maybe once it was relevant, but it's not relevant today. Now, in some ways, they have a point because in order to pay for World War II, the federal government sells a lot of bonds. It issues a lot of debt. And it wants to pay this debt back at a low interest rate, and it wants people to keep buying it. It wants the low interest rate to be competitive with other interest rates. So it wants, in general, low interest rates throughout the economy. And the Federal Reserve has been so discredited by the Great Depression that the Treasury basically runs the Federal Reserve and says, keep interest rates low. And so that's what it's doing. And so the Federal Reserve has stopped being an independent entity. It's just a sub sort of department of the Treasury. But in 1951, they negotiate what's called the Treasury-Fed Accord. And the Federal Reserve gets its independence, but it doesn't really use it. But statutorily, it now has it. And so most economists are just observing a regime in which the Federal Reserve has no power, a regime in which there is really little inflation. The inflation that is seen is there's a little burst of inflation in the Korean War. And they're saying inflation's not really important. It's not really relevant, and money's not really relevant and important. And so to break through and to make the argument, that's why Friedman and Schwartz go to history. And they're able to make that argument for history. So then Friedman is coming out with a variety of papers that are saying, when I look at economic fluctuations, he maps them side by side to fluctuations in the money supply and says, look, they fit. And other economists, remember, they're building complicated mathematical models. And Friedman's doing extremely simple stuff. And they just think it's dumb, it's not interesting, it's not true. They don't buy it at all. And so, but after a monetary history of the United States, they have to pay attention. So it's really in those years, Friedman is hammering this idea of monetarism, and it starts to become something respectable, bordering on respectable for other economists to look to and think about. And that's really the beginning of the kind of Keynesian monetarist split, where if you start to give Friedman any credence, you're heading towards a monetarist position. Now, at the same time, Friedman comes out very publicly in 1964 as a supporter of Barry Goldwater. And Keynesian economics has found a home in the Democratic Party. Its probably brightest moment in the sun is the administration of John F. Kennedy, who brings in a lot of Harvard and Yale professors to the Council of Economic Advisors. He proposes a series of spending programs that are really guided by the Keynesian philosophy. And Barry Goldwater is tremendously controversial, part for his votes against civil rights, which Friedman really supports, in part because he's a hardcore libertarian in an age when that's not in the political mainstream or not discussed in the political mainstream. And I mean, he's just tremendously unpopular, particularly in all the educated precincts where Friedman lives. So Friedman is like an outcast and a pariah for his support of Goldwater. And so that actually really affects monetarism because people feel that this is now becoming a package deal. And so there's a great reluctance to embrace Friedman's ideas because it seems like you would then have to embrace his politics.
So it's associated with conservatism.
So this is the years when conservatism, there is a movement that calls itself conservatism. And Friedman is very tightly allied with this movement from the beginning, partly through his friendship with William F. Buckley. And a lot of people say to me, yeah, but Friedman's not conservative. And this is like a bigger, we could have a whole separate podcast on this. But for now, I'll just say that conservative in the United States becomes a political brand that contains elements of conservatism that are recognizable across time and space, embrace of tradition, or comfort with hierarchy, etc. And it also has something new and different, which is Friedman's ideas about Milton Friedman's advocacy of more free markets, less government regulation, and the benefits of capitalism and the benefits of freedom. And that gets folded into American conservatism, in part because Milton Friedman is such a powerful intellectual figure. And after his advocacy of Goldwater, the media realizes this guy's really smart. He has really interesting things to say. He makes great copy. He makes a great guest. And he starts writing a column for Newsweek magazine, which is a very big deal in a much more consolidated media environment. And he's quoted in all the newspapers. And so his public profile really starts to rise right as he's pushing monetarism as an alternative to the Keynesian synthesis.
Can we just linger on what is monetarism?
Yes.
Like,
Okay. I didn't go into it.
So like what, okay, the money supply.
Yes.
So money is this thing that you can think of it like a notion where people buy and sell stuff. And there's this fascinating, complex, dynamical system of people contracting with each other in this beautiful way. I mean, there's so many pothead questions I want to ask here about the nature of money. I mean, money is fascinating in that way. And I think for Milton Friedman, trusting the flow of money is really important.
Yeah.
And the signals that pricing and money in general provides is really important.
So, yeah, and some of this, I could take some of this back again to Frank Knight. So one thing Frank Knight said to all his students was the market is the best allocation mechanism we have. Mm-hmm. The market is what allocates resources in a situation of scarcity. The market allocates them the best. And Hayek will add to that by saying prices are information signals, and a price sends information to buyers and sellers about how they should act. And these are the two of the strongest arguments for why the government should not intervene in the price system, because it will blur information or because it will allocate less efficiently than market allocation will. And so what Friedman is really going to add to that is maybe going up a level and thinking in the macro about the whole economy and how money circulates through that economy as a whole. And so what he and Anna Schwartz do is they construct what are called monetary aggregates. This is adding together, say, all the money that's on deposit in banks and all the money that's believed to be circulating in people's wallets. And you also have to really go back in time. You know, we don't have credit cards. There is a stock market, but it's tiny in terms of the number of people who invest. There aren't mutual funds. Like when traveler's checks are introduced, this is like a big deal. So we have a very simple monetary system. And so Schwartz and Milton Friedman start measuring what they call the monetary aggregates. They focus on M1 and M2, and their favorite aggregate is M2, which I believe is encompassing sort of deposits and circulating medium. The other thing to recall, there's some fine distinctions between money in savings accounts and money in checkings accounts. And money in savings accounts can earn interest and is generally believed not to circulate, where money in checking accounts does not at that time bear interest and cannot legally bear interest, and so is thought of as circulating. And then there's different institutional architectures of postal savings banks and credit unions. But Friedman is, one, taking the focus to these aggregate amounts of money and saying, these really have a lot to do with economic booms and busts. When we have an expansion in the amount of available money, we see an expansion in economic activity. When we have a contraction in available money, we have a contraction. And so he says, at this stage, the government, through the mechanism of the Federal Reserve and its influence on interest rates, can either make money more cheaply available and more freely available in the economy, or can make money more expensive and slow things down. But the central core idea of monetarism is this is potentially very bad if the government can hit the gas and then hit the brake and hit the gas and hit the brake based on, say, what a politician wants or what somebody at the Federal Reserve wants. You have a lot of instability in the system. And so one of the core policy proposals of monetarism is let's grow the money supply at a steady rate. And in the beginning, Friedman just says K%. He doesn't even put a number on it because he says the number doesn't matter. What matters is the steadiness in the growth rate, because if it's a steady growth rate, it will fade away. And then people will make economic decisions based on the fundamentals, not based on what they think is going to happen, not based on hedging against inflation or hedging against deflation. They'll just be able to function. So this is sort of the paradox of monetary policy. When it's happening right, you don't see it, you don't notice it. When it's happening wrong, Friedman argues, it can just fundamentally destabilize everything. It can cause the Great Depression, can cause an artificial boom. And so he's taking monetary policy at a time when most economists think it's completely irrelevant and saying this is the central game of the economy. Now, we live in a world where we believe this, and the Federal Reserve chair can't open their mouth without headlines being generated. But Friedman is saying this at a time when the Federal Reserve is like a mysterious and secretive organization. It's not well known. It's not deeply appreciated. Some of the only people who appreciate the Fed's power are like hardcore rural populists who have constituents, who think the banks and money power are the problem, who are like, throwbacks from the frontier days. So Friedman, in the beginning, has no constituency for this policy. He has no constituency for this analysis. And so just going back to summarize monetarism, it's using the quantity theory of money to analyze the macroeconomy. It's proposing a policy of slow and steady growth in the money supply. And then it is arguing that inflationary episodes, when they emerge, are profoundly driven by changes in the money supply, not by anything else.
I mean, and going even up a level as we started, how epic is it to develop this idea, to hold this idea, and then to convince the United States of this idea that money matters, that today we believe is mostly correct for now.
Yeah.
And so just this idea that goes against the experts and then eventually wins out and drives so much of the economy, the most powerful economy in the world. So fascinating.
Yeah. So, that's a fascinating story. And so what happens is Friedman has advanced all these ideas. He's roiled the economics profession. He's built a political profile. And then he becomes the head of the American Economics Association, and he is asked in that role to give a presidential address. And so he gives his presidential address, December 1967, and he says, I'm going to talk about inflation, and I'm going to talk about the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And this is what's generally known as the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve in its original form is derived of post-World War II data. So it's derived of about 12 years of data. And it shows that when inflation goes up, unemployment goes down. And the idea, would make sense that as the economy is heating up and lots of things are happening, more and more people are getting hired. And so this relationship has led policymakers to think that sometimes inflation is good. And if you want to lower unemployment, you could let inflation kind of go a little bit. And in the crude forms, it becomes to seem like a menu. Like you could take your model and you could plug in, I want this much unemployment. And it would say, well, great, this is how much inflation you should do. And so then you would target that inflation rate. So Friedman gets up and he says, this is wrong. This might work in the short term, but it's not going to work in the long term, because in the long term, inflation has, first of all, it has a momentum of its own. Once it gets going, it tends to build on itself. The accelerationist thesis, it accelerates. And once inflation gets going, and the reason it gets going is because, workers go to the store and they see the price level has gone up. Things have cost more. They ask for the wages to go up. Then, people eventually, the wages will go up too high and they will no longer be hireable, or companies will decide at these high wages, I can't hire as many workers, I'd better lay off. So if inflation keeps going, eventually over the long term, it will result in high unemployment. So he says, theoretically, you could end up in a situation where you have high inflation and high unemployment. This hasn't been seen, but he says theoretically this could happen. And then he goes and he says, and the government has started expanding the money supply. It started expanding the money supply in 1966. So we're going to get a bunch of inflation, and then we're going to get a bunch of unemployment. And he estimates about how long it will take. And then he says, once this all happens, it will take about 20 years to get back to normal. And
he predicts the stagflation of the 1970s.
Stagflation of the 1970s.
How gangster is that for an economist to do that? Again, against the mainstream belief represented by the Phillips curve.
Yeah, and what really makes it happen is that many of the economists who most deeply dislike Friedman and most deeply dislike his politics in the 1970s, as they're running their models, they start to say Friedman's right. They start to see in the data that he's right. And a very parallel process happens in Britain. Britain is going through a very similar sort of burst of spending, burst of inflation. And so Friedman is vindicated in this very profound way, in the way that he himself said would be the ultimate vindication, which is my theory should predict. So that prediction of stagflation is really the sort of final breakthrough of his ideas, and also, their importance to policy and to thinking about how we should intervene or not in the economy, and what the role of the Federal Reserve is, because he's saying the Federal Reserve is incredibly powerful. And finally, people start to believe him.
And I don't know if we said, but to make clear, stagflation means high unemployment and high inflation, which is a thing, like you mentioned, was not seen before.
Yeah.
And he predicted accurately. And it also disproves the sort of the relationship, the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation.
Yeah. Now, I should say the Phillips curve is still out there. It's been expectations augmented, and it is relevant in the short term. But Friedman's warning is still very much apt, that if you get too focused on unemployment, you can let inflation out of the bag. And so until very recently, the Federal Reserve's tradition has been focusing on inflation, believing that's fundamental and that will keep unemployment low, rather than trying to lower unemployment at the cost of raising inflation.